The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside his grandfather, King Charles III, toward the ceremonial gardens, where a special commemoration was about to take place. The young prince wore his finest navy blazer, polished shoes clicking softly against the ancient stone pathways that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Today was different from the usual royal engagements George had attended. This wasn't about ribbon cuttings or formal photographs. Instead, the royal family was hosting a private ceremony to honor the veterans of the Second World War, many of whom were now in their late 90s and among the last surviving heroes of their generation. As they approached the gathering, George noticed something that made him pause mid-step. Among the assembled crowd of dignitaries, palace staff, and distinguished guests, he spotted an elderly gentleman standing slightly apart from the others. The man appeared to be in his late 90s, wearing a worn but carefully pressed military uniform adorned with numerous medals that caught the morning light. What struck George most was not the man's distinguished appearance, but the fact that he was leaning heavily on a walking stick, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he struggled to maintain his balance. The veteran's name was Thomas Harrison, though George didn't know this yet. Thomas had served as a radio operator during the D-Day landings and had spent the better part of his youth fighting for the freedom that George's generation now enjoyed without question. He had received the invitation to this royal ceremony with great honor, but the journey from his small cottage in Yorkshire to Windsor Castle had taken its toll on his aging body. King Charles was engaged in conversation with several other guests, discussing the significance of the day and sharing memories of similar commemorations from years past. The palace staff moved efficiently around the garden, ensuring every detail was perfect for the ceremony that would soon begin. Royal photographers positioned themselves discreetly, ready to capture the formal moments that would later appear in official royal communications. Prince George, however, remained focused on the elderly veteran who seemed to be having difficulty. The young prince had been taught from an early age about the importance of respect, kindness, and understanding the sacrifices made by previous generations. His parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, had always emphasized that true nobility came not from titles or privileges, but from how one treated others, especially those who had given so much for their country. As George watched, he saw Thomas shift his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable but determined to maintain his dignity in the presence of royalty. The old soldier's pride was evident in his straight shoulders and lifted chin, despite the obvious physical challenges he was facing. It was a sight that stirred something deep within the young prince's heart. The royal protocol for such events was well established and carefully choreographed. Each person had their designated position, and the ceremony would proceed according to a detailed schedule that had been planned weeks in advance. Palace staff, royal guards, and family members all knew their roles and the importance of maintaining the proper decorum expected at royal functions. Yet George found himself thinking less about protocol and more about simple human kindness. He had learned about World War II in his history lessons, had heard stories of brave soldiers who faced unimaginable dangers to protect their homeland. But seeing this living piece of history standing before him, struggling but proud, made those lessons feel more real and immediate than any textbook could convey. The morning breeze rustled through the carefully tended gardens, carrying with it the scent of roses and the distant sound of London traffic beyond the castle walls. Other guests continued their conversations, some sharing their own family stories of wartime service, others discussing current events and the changing world that these veterans had helped shape through their sacrifices. George's eyes remained on Thomas Harrison, and he began to notice other details that spoke to the man's character and circumstances. The veteran's shoes, while polished to a military shine, showed signs of many years of wear. His uniform, though immaculately maintained, belonged to an era long past. Most telling of all were his hands, which bore the marks of age and hard work, yet still managed to maintain a firm grip on his walking stick, despite their obvious trembling. As the young prince stood there, weighing his options, and considering what his grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, might have done in such a situation, he felt the weight of his royal upbringing and the values that had been instilled in him since birth. He remembered countless conversations with his parents about the responsibility that came with privilege and the importance of using one's position to help others rather than simply to enjoy the benefits of rank. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in just a few minutes, and soon everyone's attention would be focused on the formal proceedings. But Prince George realized that sometimes the most meaningful moments happened not during the official program, but in the quiet spaces between scheduled events, when genuine human connection could flourish without the constraints of rigid ceremony. Thomas Harrison stood stoically, unaware that he had captured the attention of one of the youngest members of the royal family. His mind was filled with memories of comrades who hadn't made it home from the war, of friends whose names were now carved on memorial walls across Europe. He had come to this ceremony not for personal recognition, but to represent those who could no longer speak for themselves. The contrast between the young prince, born into privilege and comfort, and the elderly veteran who had earned his honors through sacrifice and service created a moment that would soon become much more significant than either of them could have imagined. It was a meeting across generations, between a boy who represented the future of the monarchy and a man who had helped secure that future through his service decades earlier. As George continued to observe, he noticed that despite Thomas's obvious discomfort, the veteran's eyes remained bright and alert, taking in every detail of the castle gardens and the royal gathering around him. There was a dignity about the man that transcended his physical limitations, a quiet strength that spoke of a generation that had faced unthinkable challenges with courage and determination. The young prince found himself at a crossroads between following established protocol and following his instincts toward compassion. His royal education had taught him the importance of both tradition and innovation, of respecting the past while adapting to serve the present. In that moment, looking at Thomas Harrison, Prince George began to understand that sometimes the most royal thing one could do was simply to be human. Without overthinking the decision, Prince George quietly excused himself from his grandfather's side and began walking toward Thomas Harrison. The movement was so natural and unassuming that most of the gathered guests didn't immediately notice the young royal making his way through the crowd. George's steps were purposeful but unhurried, the kind of measured pace that suggested thoughtful intention rather than impulsive action. As he approached the elderly veteran, George could see more clearly the toll that standing for an extended period was taking on the man. Thomas's grip on his walking stick had tightened, and small beads of perspiration had formed on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Yet the veteran's posture remained as straight as his aging body would allow, his military bearing evident even after all these decades. When George reached Thomas's side, he didn't announce himself with grand gestures or formal introductions. Instead, he simply positioned himself next to the veteran, and in a voice barely above a whisper said, "Excuse me, sir. Would you mind if I stood here with you for a moment?" Thomas turned his head slowly, his eyes widening slightly as he realized who was addressing him. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across his weathered features, followed quickly by recognition, and then something approaching disbelief. Here was Prince George, third in line to the throne, asking permission to stand beside a humble veteran from Yorkshire. "Your Highness," Thomas began, his voice carrying the slight rasp of advanced age but still strong with emotion. "It would be my honor, sir." George smiled warmly and positioned himself slightly in front of and to the side of Thomas, creating a subtle windbreak that would provide some protection from the morning breeze. But more significantly, the young prince's presence served another purpose entirely. By standing where he did, George effectively became a human shield, protecting the elderly veteran from the curious glances and potential jostling of other guests who might not have noticed Thomas's difficulties. The conversation that followed was quiet and genuine. George asked Thomas about his service, listening intently as the old soldier shared brief stories about his experiences during the war. Thomas spoke of friends he had made and lost, of the importance of duty and sacrifice, and of his gratitude for being able to witness the peaceful world that had emerged from the ashes of that global conflict. As they talked, something remarkable began to happen around them. Other guests, initially unaware of the young prince's location, gradually noticed where he had positioned himself. Instead of the usual protocol that would have brought people toward the royal family member, they instinctively gave George and Thomas more space, recognizing that something meaningful was taking place. Palace staff members, trained to keep a discreet eye on all royal family members during public events, began to take notice as well. Their initial reaction was to ensure that proper security protocols were being maintained, but as they observed the gentle interaction taking place, they found themselves stepping back rather than stepping forward. The head of security, a seasoned professional named James Morrison, made a subtle hand gesture to his team, indicating that they should maintain their watchful distance, but avoid any intervention that might disrupt what was clearly a meaningful moment. King Charles, still engaged in conversation with other dignitaries, periodically glanced in his grandson's direction. What he saw brought a mixture of pride and understanding to his features. The king recognized in George's actions the same instincts that had driven generations of the royal family to connect with people from all walks of life, to use their position not for personal aggrandizement, but for service to others. Princess Anne, known for her own dedication to duty and service, had also noticed her great-nephew's thoughtful gesture. She quietly moved closer, not to intervene, but to ensure that George and Thomas would have the space they needed for their conversation. Her presence served as an additional buffer, subtly directing other guests away from the pair, while maintaining the natural flow of the gathering. Thomas Harrison, meanwhile, found himself experiencing something he had never expected when he accepted the invitation to this royal ceremony. Rather than being a face in the crowd, rather than being overlooked because of his age or physical limitations, he was being treated with the kind of personal attention and respect that went far beyond mere courtesy. The young prince was genuinely interested in his stories, asking thoughtful questions and responding with the kind of engaged listening that had become increasingly rare in Thomas's experience. As their conversation continued, George noticed that Thomas was still struggling with his balance, despite their sheltered position. Without making a big production of it, the young prince gently suggested that perhaps Thomas might like to sit down for a few minutes before the ceremony began. He gestured toward a nearby bench that offered a perfect view of the proceedings, while providing the rest that the elderly veteran clearly needed. The suggestion was made with such grace and consideration that Thomas felt no embarrassment about accepting. As they moved slowly toward the bench, George naturally adjusted his pace to match that of his new friend, never rushing or showing any sign of impatience. Other guests, observing this careful attention to an elderly veteran's needs, found themselves moved by the young prince's maturity and compassion. Word of what was happening began to spread quietly through the gathering, not in the way that gossip spreads, but with the kind of respectful recognition that occurs when people witness something genuinely touching. Palace staff members exchanged glances that conveyed their appreciation for what they were seeing. Security personnel relaxed their postures, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of interaction that represented the best aspects of royal service to the public. The royal photographers, initially positioned to capture formal ceremonial moments, found themselves facing an unexpected decision. The intimate conversation between Prince George and Thomas Harrison was creating images that would be far more powerful than any staged photograph, yet the very spontaneity and genuineness of the moment meant that intrusive photography could destroy its authenticity. After a brief consultation among themselves and with the palace's communications team, the photographers made a collective decision to document the interaction from a respectful distance, ensuring that their presence would not interfere with the natural development of the friendship that was clearly forming between the young prince and the elderly veteran. As George and Thomas settled onto the bench, their conversation deepened. Thomas began to share more personal details about his post-war life, his career as a teacher, his family, and his ongoing involvement with veteran organizations. George listened with the kind of focused attention that revealed his genuine interest in learning about lives different from his own sheltered royal experience. The other members of the royal family, observing from various positions around the garden, began to understand that they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just a polite interaction between royalty and a member of the public. It was a genuine connection between two people separated by generations, but united by shared values of respect, duty, and human dignity. Palace officials, initially concerned about the deviation from planned protocol, gradually realized that this unscripted moment was creating exactly the kind of positive representation of the monarchy that no amount of careful planning could have achieved. The sight of young Prince George showing such natural compassion and respect for an elderly veteran spoke to the future of the royal family in ways that formal ceremonies, however well executed, could never accomplish. The morning air filled with the quiet murmur of appreciation as other guests began to recognize the significance of what they were witnessing. This was not a performance or a calculated gesture for public relations purposes. This was simply a young person treating an elder with the respect and attention he deserved, guided by values that transcended rank and privilege. As the formal ceremony was about to begin, something unprecedented happened that would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. Prince George, still seated beside Thomas Harrison on the bench, noticed that the elderly veteran was struggling to stand as the official proceedings were called to order. Without hesitation, the young prince rose first and gently extended his arm to Thomas, offering the kind of steady support that the older man clearly needed. The gesture was so natural, so instinctive, that it took several moments before the full significance of what was happening registered with the assembled crowd. Here was a member of the royal family, a future king, providing physical assistance to help an elderly veteran rise to his feet. The sight was both humble and profound, representing everything that the monarchy aspired to be in its relationship with the people it served. Thomas Harrison, accepting the young prince's assistance with gratitude and dignity, slowly stood and steadied himself with his walking stick. For a moment, the two figures stood side by side, the 10-year-old prince and the 96-year-old veteran, representing different eras but united in their shared humanity and mutual respect. What happened next surprised everyone, including the royal family members and palace staff who thought they had seen every possible variation of royal protocol during their years of service. As Prince George continued to stand beside Thomas, ensuring the elderly man felt secure and included in the ceremony, the assembled crowd began to take notice in a way that went beyond polite observation. First, the other veterans present at the ceremony began to straighten their postures and turn their attention toward George and Thomas. These men and women, themselves heroes of various conflicts throughout the decades, recognized in the young prince's actions something that resonated deeply with their own values of service, sacrifice, and looking after one's comrades. Then, in a moment that would later be described by witnesses as both spontaneous and inevitable, something extraordinary occurred among the royal guards and palace security personnel. James Morrison, the head of security who had been carefully monitoring the situation throughout the morning, found himself so moved by what he was witnessing that he made a decision that went against every protocol in his extensive training manual. Instead of maintaining his position at the perimeter of the gathering, Morrison slowly and deliberately removed his ceremonial hat and placed it over his heart, standing at attention in a gesture of respect that honored not just the royal family member he was assigned to protect, but the elderly veteran who was receiving such thoughtful care from the young prince. The effect was immediate and profound. Seeing their superior officer's gesture, the other members of the royal guard followed suit. One by one. These highly trained security professionals, men and women who had devoted their careers to protecting the royal family, removed their hats and stood in silent tribute to the scene unfolding before them. The sight of the royal guard stepping back in pure respect created a ripple effect throughout the gathering. Palace staff members, many of whom had worked at royal residences for decades and had witnessed countless ceremonies and official functions, found themselves equally moved by the genuine emotion of the moment. Kitchen staff who had stepped outside to observe the ceremony, gardeners who had been working nearby, and administrative personnel who had paused in their duties to watch the proceedings, all stood in respectful silence. King Charles, observing the unprecedented response of his staff and security team to his grandson's simple act of kindness, felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over him. Pride in George's natural compassion was joined by a deeper understanding of how the monarchy could continue to evolve and remain relevant in an ever-changing world. This wasn't about grand gestures or carefully orchestrated public relations campaigns. This was about basic human decency, expressed through the actions of a child who had been raised to understand that true nobility came from service to others. Thomas Harrison, the object of all this unexpected attention, found himself overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't experienced since his own military service ended decades earlier. The feeling of being truly seen, truly valued, not just as a historical curiosity or a symbol of past sacrifice, but as a human being worthy of respect and friendship, brought tears to his weathered eyes. As the formal ceremony proceeded, with readings and speeches honoring the veterans' service to their country, Prince George remained close to Thomas, occasionally checking to ensure the elderly man was comfortable and engaged. The young prince's attention to his new friend never wavered, even as other guests approached to pay their respects to both the royal family member and the veteran he had chosen to honor with his presence. The photographers, who had been documenting the event from a respectful distance, captured images that would later be recognized as among the most powerful photographs in recent royal history. The pictures showed not just a young prince being kind to an elderly veteran, but something deeper. They showed the future of the monarchy embodying the values that had always been at the heart of royal service, expressed through genuine human connection rather than ceremonial formality. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to mingle and share refreshments, George continued to stay with Thomas, introducing him to other members of the royal family and ensuring that the veteran felt like a valued guest rather than simply another attendee. The conversations that followed were rich with shared stories, laughter, and the kind of intergenerational understanding that bridges decades of different experiences. Palace staff members, who had initially been concerned about the deviation from planned protocol, found themselves working together to ensure that Thomas Harrison's experience would be as comfortable and meaningful as possible. Extra chairs were discreetly positioned for his use, refreshments were brought directly to him so he wouldn't have to navigate the crowd, and arrangements were quietly made to ensure his transportation home would be comfortable and convenient. The impact of the morning's events extended far beyond the immediate ceremony. Word of Prince George's thoughtful treatment of Thomas Harrison began to spread among veteran organizations throughout the country, not as a public relations story, but as genuine recognition of a young person who understood the value of honoring those who had served their country with distinction. For Thomas Harrison, the experience marked a profound moment in his later years. The respect and friendship shown by Prince George had given him something precious, the knowledge that his service and sacrifice had not been forgotten by the younger generation, and that the values he had fought to protect were being carried forward by those who would one day lead the nation. In the months that followed, Thomas would receive a personal letter from Prince George, thanking him for sharing his stories and expressing hope that they would meet again soon. The letter, written in the young prince's own hand, would become one of Thomas's most treasured possessions, representing not just a connection to the royal family, but proof of a genuine friendship that had formed across the boundaries of age, class, and circumstance. The Royal Guard members who had spontaneously removed their hats in respect would later describe the moment as one of the most meaningful of their careers. They had sworn to protect the royal family, but that morning they had witnessed something that reminded them why the monarchy was worth protecting: its capacity to inspire ordinary people to extraordinary acts of kindness and service. As the sun set over Windsor Castle that evening, the events of the day had already begun to take on a significance that would resonate far beyond the immediate participants. Prince George's gentle gesture had indeed silenced the palace, but not through any grand pronouncement or dramatic action. Instead, it had created a moment of profound quiet, a pause in the usually busy world of royal protocol, during which everyone present had been reminded of the simple but powerful truth that sometimes the most royal thing one can do is simply treat another person with dignity, respect, and genuine care. The story would be retold in veteran halls and royal circles alike, becoming part of the larger narrative about how the monarchy could continue to serve and inspire in an age when genuine human connection had become increasingly rare and valuable. It was a reminder that true leadership often happens not in grand gestures or formal speeches, but in quiet moments when someone chooses compassion over protocol and service over status.